So just an outline of what I'm going to talk about. Basically, why collect data, just a reminder, and then think about other data commitments that countries have in general, and how it might be possible to link some of those data commitments, and thinking about the purpose of data. And it's very much focused on the learners and the whole purpose of improving things for the learners, looking at the framework as a whole, and then some examples of what we might think about when we're moving towards a strategy for data collection. So data is a key building block and a real pivotal input. It's useful for decision making, obviously budget and policy formulation, monitoring and evaluation, but importantly in a more systematic manner, an evidence-based manner. And we really need good data on learner outcomes, and particularly the barriers faced by learners. We're particularly focused on maybe learners with diverse and special educational needs, and that's really important for the monitoring process and evaluating the impact of inclusive education policies. So how we know what works, how well we're doing. But importantly, we need this data to ensure that any interventions are really tailored to meet the different needs of learners. And it's all about, as I said, the learners and promoting high quality and equitable education and training. So some of the existing commitments countries are signed up to: United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 4, which talks about inclusive and equitable education, about monitoring progress by gender, disability, ethnic background. Also the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which looks at school attendance and dropout, and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which looks at data to highlight gaps in educational opportunities and outcomes, and to identify people at risk of being left behind, and particular barriers to inclusion of people with disabilities. So countries will be collecting data for these other purposes, and sometimes it seems to be done in a sort of silo approach, so more joined up thinking, and maybe it's possible to make connections with some of the data that's already collected but can be used in different ways. So those are international level commitments, but similarly at the European level, the European Commission want quantitative and qualitative information collected, for example, gender, socioeconomic background, migrant background, Roma learners, regional differences, as well as on factors that can have an impact on learning outcomes, such as taking part in early childhood education, attendance at school, engagement in learning, achievement in basic skills, well-being and mental health, which is probably an increasing area for most of us, sense of belonging, behavioural issues, experience of discrimination, and so on. And at the European level, there's a European education area, European work on discrimination, and the pathways to school success in particular, which is looking at early school leaving and the legacy of COVID, things like impact on progression, learners who are disconnecting from school, leaving early, but also, as I mentioned, well-being and mental health. And then at agency level, the European agency, you probably know about this, that EASNIE data has been collected annually from participating member countries. It sets out operational and working definitions for the topics it's covering, and also collects country background information. So there's some context for the data that's collected. And to date, it's looked at data on all learners and learners with an official decision of special educational needs. And it's looked at mainstream and inclusive education, learners who are in separate units and classes within mainstream schools, but also learners who are in separate schools and units. And importantly, units run by education, but also by other ministries, learners who are in alternative education, learners in homeschooling, and those who are out of a recognised form of education. And certainly a couple of years ago, I did some work on the EASNIE data, and there was a lot of gaps, I have to say, in the data on some of those issues, particularly learners who are out of education, maybe in alternative provision. So that's something that needs to be addressed. So there are some changes for in the EASNIE data collection from 2026. They'll continue with data on access and placement for all learners. That's including pre-primary to upper secondary, those all learners, and then those with an official decision of special educational needs. Trying to improve the definition so they align to other international data and agency work, actually reducing the numerical country data questions and the number of calculated indicators, but there will be some core indicators of inclusive education systems, such as special needs identification rates, inclusion and segregation rates, and again learners out of education, and the beginning to look at taking the data beyond children and learners with a decision of special educational needs. So why we collect data? Overall, monitoring and evaluation activities need to focus on the school and the classroom level. This is where inclusion really comes into action. So we need data on all learners, including those with the most complex needs. Looking at learning, what progress and success look like. And we know that for some of the learners we're talking about with complex needs, progress isn't just about academic achievement, gaining qualifications. It may be small steps of progress and success it's not linear. It can be much broader. So a broader focus on wider achievement, things like relationships, and maybe progress in terms of a reduction in the level of support that learners require. So we need ways of measuring. So if we haven't got ways of measuring for all learners, how do we know if their rights to education and in education are being fulfilled? We need so accurate data on those learners who may not be in education at all, looking at access, but also participation and engagement and the experiences for all those learners. Looking at the barriers, what needs to be improved, and looking at disaggregated data on learners, so we can look at those groups who are particularly vulnerable to underachievement or maybe to exclusion from education, so we can target responses, understand what's working and what can be improved. But we also need data for accountability and what stakeholders are happy to be held accountable for. And in schools, most stakeholders will be happy to be held accountable for the achievement of learners. That's their sort of fundamental purpose. So, but it's got to be in line with the inclusive values, and people have to know about their roles and responsibilities, and also that is in line with their training and experience, so they are not held accountable for things that they're not really equipped to do. But we also need the shared language across stakeholder groups, across system levels, and making sure that people in the system understand formative, summative data and those connections between data, so it's used appropriately and maybe there's not a distortion. And as it was said in the literature review, we need data that's based on a understanding of balanced learner development, so that wider view of progress and achievement. We're also focusing here on inclusion and equity in particular. Now, we've mentioned disaggregated data to know which groups are performing well, which maybe need more support or different initiatives. But this always brings about a bit of a dilemma, how to use labels to make sure those groups are visible, but also identify potential barriers, but not having a negative effect on practice, such as stigmatizing learners or segregating them from their peers on grounds of maybe disability. Also an impact on expectations. So we need to use labels in a sensitive way, and I think this can be achieved. And increasingly there's recognition that many learners face more than one challenge. So in terms of labels, they could receive a number of labels, multiple labels, and recent agency work points to trends away from a focus only on disability to talking more about diversity. Mentioned the single legislative framework for all learners. So within that, we want to collect quantitative and qualitative information on those factors which affect learning outcomes. And we need a balance of that data to identify maybe patterns, themes and trends that can help us to guide teaching and learning, curriculum development, support that learners need, and overall focus on school improvement. So to sum up, within the framework, the QAMA framework, we're focusing on learners' rights to education. We want data that's going to help us catch those learners that might be falling through the cracks, those ones that sort of slip under the radar that we may not notice. Clarity about what forms of alternative education, homeschooling, other forms of education are available, and who is in that system. The learners may be attending part-time rather than full-time, learners who've been maybe unofficially excluded from school for various reasons. So do we really know where learners are and what are their experiences, and whether they are actually getting their right to education? And once they're in education, are they getting their reasonable adjustments, support that they need to make progress and achieve? And this includes data on all learners, not just maybe those who can access tests and exams, but a way of assessing those learners who have more complex needs and maybe need a more flexible system that takes account of that wider achievement we talked about. And data on learners, in particular those vulnerable to underachievement, potentially disadvantaged, so sensitive use of characteristics, gender, economic background, disability, racial, ethnic and linguistic background, and so on. We're trying to get a more strategic approach, a more joined up approach to this complex area. As with the QAMA framework and a lot of the agency frameworks looking at inclusive education, it really starts with some underpinning assumptions, if you like, that vision and goals are agreed with all stakeholders, and that there is a clear, widely understood definition of inclusive education. That sounds maybe a bit obvious, but it's amazing how many countries and stakeholders don't actually have that widely agreed view of inclusive education, and that makes it quite hard to monitor what's happening and for everybody to be pulling in the same direction. And a second assumption, that there is a single legal and policy framework for all learners, that there's not sort of bolt-on bits for different groups and so on. All learners means all learners, and they're all within the education legal and policy framework. The main focus, school improvement process. So we're not only talking about accountability, that's important, but we're looking at a school improvement process which really needs a culture of trust, shared accountability, collaboration, which are all fundamental for inclusive practice. So there's nothing new there, but that's really underpinning any sort of data strategy. If we're going to take a more strategic approach, the plan needs to be clear about roles, responsibilities, about accountability, resources, timescales, monitoring, all the things you would normally have in a plan, which some of it will probably be reviewing what you've already got in place, maybe some consolidation, setting up structures and processes. Some countries maybe have cross-sector groups at ministry level or regional levels, and have channels for communication, clear leadership roles, and so on. But where possible, it's better to use existing structures and try not to get too bureaucratic. I know that is often an issue, that we just create more groups to look at more things and end up with more and more paperwork and time-consuming things which aren't really going to be effective. UNESCO have got a recent publication out on data collection. I'll give you the reference at the end of the PowerPoint. But they point out the main challenges with this sort of work is a shortage of skilled personnel to work in this area. Obviously limited resources because it all has a cost attached, but essentially poor communication between different stakeholders. So they're areas that can be addressed maybe by professional development, use of technology, and improved collaboration, which is essential for most areas when we're talking about inclusive education or any education policy and practice. So I'm going to move on to some examples of just some models that look more holistically, a sort of data ecosystem, if you like, focus data at all levels that will lead to action at that level, but also interaction between the levels, and there's a sort of building on the levels. Some examples of data at school level: learner assessment, data from learner assessment, from teacher appraisal, from professional learning, cross-sector working, school environment and organisation, management of resources, self and external evaluation, stakeholder surveys. So schools actually have a lot of data, but it's about making best use of that, and what from that is then passed on to regional, local and national levels, so that regional policymakers can have a picture of the school type and location, the resources, the teachers, the learners, funding sources and expenditure and so on. And similarly at national level, so that there's a combination of regional and local data. And importantly at national level, maybe that there's also surveys and censuses and other working with other ministries such as health, social care, labour and so on, that actually combines these sources of data to really dig into some of the policy decisions that are made and what is effective. And UNESCO in this publication point out that policymakers need to be aware of fundamental data that's needed. So they suggest kind of 4 areas: data sources, data production, data reporting and data use. So we'll look in a little bit more detail at their suggestions. So data sources, and again I'd be interested to hear, you know, what you've got access to and what you actually use in your situations. But things like surveys and population censuses on literacy, educational attainment, household socio-economic indicators, labour market indicators, learning assessments, we've mentioned at the school-based assessments, test scores, characteristics, surveys, international assessments such as PISA, and then administrative records, school infrastructure, where the schools are, what type of schools, teachers and information on teachers, information on students, and then a key area, sources of funding, expenditure, type of expenditure. And so again, you'd need to combine that with the learner outcome data, for example, to look at how effectively funds are being used and so on. Just who is responsible for collecting data and why? So it just tries to pull together what school leaders, the role and responsibilities of school leaders, information for monitoring, evaluation, formative feedback for school improvement, and then summative, that schools are accountable to learners, parents and other stakeholders. In the middle tier, again, monitoring, evaluation and feedback, but also summative accountability to school stakeholders, budget allocations and so on. And then at national level, the whole system, infrastructure, school type and location, workforce, learners, outcomes and destinations and so on. So again, UNESCO data quality checklist, just to stress that data should be relevant, accessible and comparable. So this is the sort of data reporting. Does the data source include the required information? Is it available for the groups of interest? And when was the data published? Is it the most recent? Is it comparable over time and across countries? Is it accessible to all users? Is it user friendly? And is it accessible in a timely way? So this is a second example, really. It's a similar information, but a slightly different presentation. It was developed from some other recent agency work. Again, starts with the focus on the learner. I won't go through it all, but building from focus on the learner with teacher assessment, formative and summative. And I think that's important there to differentiate between that, in particular for those learners I mentioned where they're not included in standardized tests and exams, that there's some teacher assessment which is relevant and shows progress of all learners. And importantly, their learner and stakeholder feedback, so listening to learners and families' views of the school and assessing the progress in those wider areas. So from learner to school level, again, the same content, regional, national level, school attendance data, and also, as we mentioned earlier, making links to other data sources such as the UN conventions and so on. But really digging into school attendance and making sure that you've got information on where all these learners are and any that are dropping out of the system. As I said, importantly, that sources can be combined to answer more specific questions, and school attendance data, efficient use of resources, but also a longer term view, looking at trying to improve the system and taking a more preventative approach. We talk about prevention, intervention and compensation. The more we can improve schools, the more we can prevent difficulties from occurring, will reduce the need for intervention and compensation at a later stage. And as more countries take this sort of approach, like a universal approach, short-term interventions, and then sort of special and multi-agency support, it's important to have information on what works to really improve the situation for all learners and make sure that as diversity of needs increases in schools, more and more learners' needs can be met within the universal provision without having to fund or having to differentiate support and maybe excluding learners or putting them into special education.